Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. In the first segment of today's show, we're going to discuss U.S. aid to Israel, military aid more specifically. That has been brought forth as something that should be conditional if Israel does choose to annex parts of the West Bank as well as the Jordan Valley. Now, all of this comes in the context, of course, of the fact that Netanyahu has announced that he would go ahead and annex those parts of the occupied territories. Nevertheless, that has not yet started, but may very well start in the coming days as well. There does seem to be some delay because not all U.S. officials, seemingly at least on the outside, are completely on board with this all happening right at this time. Nevertheless, some Democrat lawmakers have grouped together to say that, as I said, that there should be conditional aid now in Israel if it does go ahead with that annexation. The issue of U.S. aid to Israel in some parts of the U.S. has been controversial for a very long time. This is not a new issue, but it is certainly new for Democrats to come out this openly and now propose something like this. The likes of AIPAC and others, understandably, have, of course, come out against this, saying that there should be no conditions. Joe Biden as well, the Democrat presidential candidate, has also said he disagrees with any conditional aid for Israel, as does Nancy Pelosi. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. We're now joined by Mehdi Eliefifi, who is a political analyst and a member of the U.S. Democratic Party. He's joining us this morning from New York. And joining us from Washington, D.C. is James Patterson, who is a former diplomat and member of the American Foreign Service Association, Republican National Committee. He's also a former elected official in Washington, D.C. James and Mehdi, good morning to you both, and thank you for your time. Mehdi, let me start with you. It is new, is it not, for Democrat lawmakers to come out this openly and propose something along the lines of conditional aid to Israel?
Good morning to you and your audience. It is really new for the Democratic Party, especially with that openness to come out and discuss anything related to Israel. As you can understand, the support to the Israeli government and to Israel is being very well established within the U.S. society in general, specifically with the political arena. You can see this clearly with any one who's running for president or who's running for office. The first thing that come out of their mouths is just the complete support to Israel. I think what have happened from this few of the Democrats that want to put some condition to any aid that goes to Israel is not well established. It's just an attempt from the few mainly new members of Congress to come out and put such a condition, especially, as you said, in an open way like that. I don't think that this will go along with the many other members, either Democrat or Republican. I think it's been established in the U.S. society that a complete support to Israel is part of the whole system and part of the security of both country and the Middle East.
James, what are your thoughts on this sort of a proposal?
You know, I don't think it's unusual for segments of the Democratic Party to support terrorist groups like Hamas and terror states like Iran. And so I don't think it's unusual. It's not surprising to see that they're trying to penalize Israel and support the Hamas in this effort by the Israelis to secure their borders. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 established the borders of Israel, and that was everything east of Jordan is Israel, and that Israel has a right to occupy that territory. That's never been rescinded, and it still has the effect of law in the region. The other thing is that Hamas, Article 7 of the Hamas covenant calls for, or is an incitement for genocide that calls for the killing of all Jews as being a religious tenet of the people who form the Hamas group. It isn't.
Yeah, but James, if we're completely honest, there are a lot of Israeli rabbis too, right, who have said Palestinian lives are worth less than the fingernail of a Jewish Israeli. I mean, we have such rhetoric on both sides if we're completely honest with each other, which is completely unhelpful to the situation. So I don't want to go down the rhetorical route, right? Because we can pick and choose and we can argue till there is no tomorrow when it comes to that. But within all of this, then, James, what of the Palestinian people and their rights? I mean, the issue of annexation, as you well know, is one that even Israeli allies, be it in Europe or be it in other places of the world, who cannot be called anti-Semitic or who cannot be called anti-Israel in any regard, are telling the Israelis, listen, this is not the right time to do this. What are your thoughts on that?
Whether it's the right time to do it is a matter of the internal politics of the state of Israel. The Prime Minister Netanyahu and Ambassador David Friedman have extended their hands to negotiate with Hamas, but they've chosen not to participate. I suspect this is because you have these members of the Democratic Party telling segments in Israel and telling Hamas that the political climate in D.C. will change in November to their favor, and that they should not, they should at this time resist any effort to negotiate, any honest effort to negotiate. And so the negotiation hasn't taken place. They've stepped away from the table. That was very unwise. And so they should return to negotiate and continue to work on a two-state solution.
All right, Mehdi, what are your thoughts on the issue of annexation as a whole, right? As I'd put to James as well, even Israel's traditional allies are telling it that this is probably not the right move at this point. That's very likely what's been behind Netanyahu's calculation and not going ahead with it immediately come July 1st. Do you think that it will happen? What kind of an effect would it have?
I think the Israelis are looking forward to do this. Unfortunately, there is a huge support to anything that Israel does in the U.S. I think Netanyahu is making a calculated effort to do this in steps. Some of this will be to annex the settlement that are closer to Israel than just do the whole thing. The support of this in terms of the European Union does not exist as of now. Even the support in the U.S. is very well known, but I think that there is some reservation from not just the Democratic members, some of the Democratic members, but in general, the blind support to Israel created this animosity that we see in the whole Muslim and Arab world. But I think one of the main reasons that Israel continues to do whatever they want is the lack of resistance or from the Muslim and the Arab world. President Trump have visited Riyadh a couple of years ago, and there was more than 50 countries, and the U.S. went ahead and moved the embassy to Jerusalem, and there was no resistance whatsoever. I think there is an understanding here in the U.S. that the security of Israel is part of the security of the U.S., and unfortunately, there is no balance. I don't think that the Palestinians are the ones that, regardless of, we all understand we don't support any terrorist organization or whatever labeled as terrorist organization, but in the same time, some of the lawmakers in the U.S. blindly support all the atrocities that the Israeli go and commit with the Palestinians.
Okay, just because we're quickly running out of time, Mehdi, I do apologize. I interrupt you. I just wanted to, under a minute, if you can, Mehdi, just tell me if you believe that the tide is slowly changing in the U.S., where there may possibly be, in the eyes of the Palestinians at least, a more balanced approach towards that issue.
I don't think there will be a more balanced issue. There will be some members that support the right of Palestinian, but you got to understand we have a huge lobby from the AIPAC and also from the some of the Democrat and majority of Republican to support whatever Israel is doing, with giving a blind eyes to the Palestinian, and it will continue in this support because there is no real lobbying in the U.S. for the Palestinian right.
Okay, we'll have to leave it there at that. I know it's not the best of us, but we do sincerely appreciate both Mehdi and James for their time and, of course, their insight. Viewers, we've tried to give you, on this, again, sensitive topic, both points of view, and it's important to listen to both points of view properly and openly. James there spoke about the fact that the Palestinians have not played ball when it comes to negotiations. Of course, the Palestinians would very much argue against that. There's also talk about the Balfour Declaration, etc. I mean, there's a lot of course, to go through and debate when it comes to those issues, but nevertheless, it is seemingly, at least on the outside, symbolic that a few Democrat lawmakers, or about a dozen or so, would come together and say that aid to Israel should be placed conditional. That's a very sensitive territory when it comes to the U.S. policy, whatever side of the aisle you find yourself on. Even Democrats have not yet ever done this in these past years. Seemingly, they would not, possibly want to anger the Israeli lobby, if that is as strong as we are told to understand from the outside in again. But nevertheless, as I said, it's important to discuss these things openly, so because they have a very real world effect on the ground, right, in the occupied territories for both Israelis and Palestinians, and any possibility of peace or any possibility really of a two-state solution, to which is, by the way, what the rest of the world continues to say it stands by as a possible peaceful resolution to that issue. I'll be back with the next segment after this. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss Hindu nationalism, also known as Hindutva nationalism or Hindutva ideology, RSS ideology. I mean, it goes by many terms and around the world and phrases. Nevertheless, it's found its way into the Indian diaspora around the world, especially in the Indian diaspora, even in the West as well. There was some controversy this past Ramadan in Canada, where some municipalities allowed for the call to prayer to be read out, recited loudly to an extent in certain vicinities, like I said, simply because, of course, of the COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that people were not able to attend to mosques because of social distancing rules, etc. Now, the controversy surrounding that was quite Islamophobic in nature, and the far right, of course, jumped on that. And yes, there is a far right, even in a multicultural society like Canada, and a lot of, unfortunately, of the Indian diaspora. I won't say a lot, but some of the Indian diaspora, some of those who sign on to the RSS ideology, also supported the far right in that regard, and some of them were let go of their jobs because of their social media posts. Now, this is also then stretched to places like the Persian Gulf countries and a lot of places like the UAE and others, where we also have Indian expats who have posted on social media some worryingly Islamophobic, opinions and rhetoric. What does all of this mean? Because all of this comes also in the context of a recent report out in Global News in Canada that the Indian intelligence is trying to sway Canadian policies, possibly in favor of Indian policies as well, or in a favorable view of India, and possibly even an anti-Pakistan stance as well. Now, all of this also, the other context is what India has done with Kashmir, occupied Kashmir, as far as revocation of Article 370, as well as the citizenship law within the country, which does, if we're completely honest, target Muslims in that country as well. Let's discuss all of that a bit further. There's a lot to get through. We're now joined by Mirza Saaib, who is a Kashmiri lawyer. He delivers lectures on Kashmir at Oxford, Cambridge, SOAS, and Westminster Universities. He's in India. He is part of the Kashmir Reading Room and Kashmir Study Circle. He's currently joining us from London. Joining us this morning from Toronto is Stephen Zhou, who is an investigative journalist who focuses on national security and discrimination issues. Stephen was the one whose article was published in Foreign Policy on this very issue. Stephen and Mirza, thank you both for your times today. Stephen, let me start with you. You did a lot of work when it came to investigating this issue. Just brief us, if you can, very quickly about the issue of the RSS and or Hindu nationalism ideology and its spread within Canada.
Well, I think the exact details are going to take a lot more work in terms of investigation. But what we can say is that just like pretty much many other countries around the world right now, India, as a major power in the region, is trying to flex its muscles around the world and influence policy in the West. And, it's a legitimate kind of concern that they may have with regards to what place they have in the world and how they can influence their diaspora, the Indian diaspora, to become an asset for them. The problem, as far as I can tell in recent days, is what happens when this kind of global reach arrives in different countries that are multicultural and arrive in a way that carry with it a very sharp kind of anti-Muslim sectarianism or any other kind of discrimination. So in the United States, I think it's a lot more clear through, figures on both sides of the political divide. Tulsi Gabbard on the Democratic Party, Donald Trump on the right wing, that the RSS ideology or Hindutva and Hindu nationalism is an influential voice in terms of how the United States, how Washington D.C. deals with that country, and therefore deals with countries that India is concerned about.
Mirza, of course, the Indians argue, as Stephen possibly alluded to in his earlier answer there, that they have a right to possibly want to have, of course, their diaspora to be on their side, right? Even if it is the BJP government in power, even possibly when it comes to lobbying any government, right? I mean, that happens in many regards. Why should that be worrying us?
Well, primarily, there's a furious pace of overt discrimination against Muslims in India, which is now being exported abroad as well. And there is a clear decline in a willingness to see Muslims as equal people, equal citizens within India and equal people outside India. And this is why within India, you see lynch mobs that are set free, lynch mobs that are even people who have been accused of lynching and are still facing trial have been garlanded by sitting ministers in India. This is why India's Prime Minister Modi is often late to condemn incidents where Muslims have been targeted, which conveys a silent approval through this gesture. So what is unfolding in India right now is an authoritarian regime that is imposing its own puritanical definition of nationhood or citizenry that is singularly designed to exclude Muslims. And since 2014, there's been an active zeal with which Muslims are being re-educated to teach us our place in society by openly calling for a Hindu Rashtra, by rarely punishing lynch mobs, and by dispossessing Muslims of our places of worship, as you saw the Supreme Court case of Babri Masjid, or by openly, changing names of places which had a Muslim name, such as Allahabad to Prayagraj. Now, what needs to be understood is that, of course, there is freedom of expression, but a Hindu Rashtra does not have place for anyone. It does not even have place for Hindus themselves. There is no place for Dalits in a Hindu Rashtra. The treatment that has been meted out to them, to SC, the scheduled caste community in India also. So coming to the point that you were making about Canada and the global implications of what is taking place right now, the example that you are referring to is one of Ravi Huda, who was a volunteer for the local branch of the Hindu Swayam Sevak Sangh, the HSS, which is an overseas branch, or it looks into the foreign interests of the RSS. But what has to be understood is that Ravi Huda's case is just one of the many such cases. In fact, recently, there was research from a European-based group called the Disinfo Lab, which revealed that there are over 260 fake news outlets which cover nearly 65 countries throughout the Western world. All of these groups were registered by the Srivastava group, which is the same group that organized a trip of the far-right MEPs, the member of European Parliament. They had organized a trip to Kashmir recently. So there is a connection to all of this. This is a well-organized, well-oiled machinery, which is obviously going to be an asset for the Modi government. Now, the reason this is concerning for us is that once these groups gain leverage in the diaspora, they gain leverage with citizens of the diaspora as well as governments of the diaspora.
Indeed.
And because of that, you will see most governments maintaining silence over things that are taking place in India. Ghastly things.
On that point, if I may, I just interrupt you, Mirza, but on that very good point that you've just made there, I wanted to go to you, Stephen, because you mentioned this as well in your article about how Canadian officials reacted or didn't, in fact, after recent Indian moves, be it towards Kashmir or be it towards citizenship laws within Indian borders. Do you think that this is already having an effect? And what does that then say for a country which is so multicultural, such as Canada, that is meant to be, of course, treating all of its own citizens equally, and secondly, also speaking about human rights issues around the world on an equal basis?
Well, I mean, the reaction to, say, the anti-Muslim riots or, frankly, pogroms in New Delhi in February from the Liberal Party here in Canada, the ruling party. I mean, it was relatively tepid and some would say silent, and it angered a lot of people, and it received, backlash from community groups. But it's unclear whether or not we can draw a straight line from that tepid reaction to the lobbying of certain pro-India groups or pro-India community groups here in Canada. However, we know that this kind of lobbying is happening. We know that the Indian government, is not an insignificant player in the world. The Canadian government is going to be very careful in terms of how they deal with that. And it's very easy for a lot of observers, and I don't think it's, not outside of common sense, to say that, or to perhaps conclude that, it's within the realm of reality or possibility that this kind of lobbying is having an effect. But again, the lobbying is a legitimate activity within a liberal democracy. But with this lobbying is coming within civil societies when it comes to Indian issues or issues that affect India or countries that matter to India. We're seeing a kind of like a very loud, boisterous, offensive, openly Islamophobic, discriminatory voices, many of them who are probably just bots from some troll farm somewhere, that is appearing online. And also, again, like some of the figures we've been talking about, real life people with real life jobs being very open about it, and and either end up losing their jobs or whatever.
Indeed. Mirza, I'll give you the word before I let both of you go. When we're talking about those online bots, right, that is something that one notices a lot, in fact, online when it comes to the Indian Twitter, especially whenever it comes to anything that is in any way critical of India online. How important do you think that entire that entire wave, if I may call it that entire cyber army even, is to this Indian image and propagation of RSS ideology, etc.?
Well, it's very important for their soft ideology, for their soft part, because it creates a wave of acceptance. But you see, whether Twitter exists or does not exist, even before social media, there was a large amount of acceptance in the Indian society for the marginalization of Muslims, and there's always been an indifference of Indian Hindus. There's a general inclination to accept an anti-Muslim narrative. It's quite apparent in India. And this has effect not just in spatial terms, in terms of representation of Muslims in public spaces, in offices, public offices, but also from a psychological perspective on Muslims. And any space that is being occupied, which includes a social media space, it is essential for them to counter and subjugate and come attack people. In fact, I often get trolled quite viciously online with threats which range from different levels of violence. But it's essential for them to do it because they feel that this is a psychological way of attacking people who challenge the dominant narrative.
Very well. We'll leave that, but we do sincerely appreciate both Mirza and Stephen for their time today. Mirza, they're speaking to us from London, and Stephen was speaking to us from Toronto. Now, this issue of how the spread of Islamophobia coming out of India to the rest of the world, to the Indian diaspora, in even Western countries, where, as Stephen there described, in a country that is as multicultural as Canada, a liberal democracy, right, where, sure, lobbying is very much allowed. That does happen within those societies and is a very normal thing. But nevertheless, if you're lobbying for hatred in some ways, you would imagine and you would think that Canadian officials should know better than to sign on to that, and or should still have their values in place to still be able to say, listen, what's wrong is wrong. We need to speak out against what's wrong. So I'm speaking specifically here about what happened with Article 370 in Kashmir, as in, of course, then the citizenship law as well that was passed on the Indian mainland as well, which again targets Muslims quite openly, if we're completely honest. What does that then mean? India would say on the other side, listen, we're a huge country. Like Stephen there said, we're a huge country. We have a power in the world, and we need to flex our power and make ourselves known. So is India wrong to be going around lobbying for its points of view? These are all things that, of course, need to be debated and spoken of openly. I'll be back with my final segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here on Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. In this segment, we're going to discuss the UK counterterrorism and sentencing bill, which is set to be passed fairly soon. It's already gone through the second reading, I believe, in the House of Commons. That rolls back commitments to, in fact, review the PREVENT program. The PREVENT program has, for many Muslims, been something that has targeted specifically, really, their community, even though in more recent times that seemingly has been changed to then include some of those on the far right. Also, nevertheless, the more concerning part, or one of the other more concerning parts of this newer bill, is its loosening of the definition of who may fit the definition of a terrorist. So it may very well also include just Black Lives Matter protesters or environmentalists or those who are pro-migrants, etc. So this very loose definition of who exactly is an extremist/terrorist is also worrying campaigners in the UK. What does this mean going forward for just basic freedoms and rights to be able to stand up for what you believe in the country? Let's discuss this a bit further. We're firstly now joined by Eliefifi, who is a journalist and filmmaker. He's usually based in Oxford, UK, but he's joining us today from Bordeaux in France. Eliefifi, thanks for your time today. What do you make of the bill? I mean, obviously, when we talk about the PREVENT program and the need to review that, that's extremely important, but also within the context of BLM protests, for those protesters to now be targeted with a terror bill is kind of worrying too, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess it is. It is a development. In a sense, though, it's really an extension of the existing engagement with such communities. I mean, we've seen some of the BLM protests or the I Can't Breathe protests targeted already by more soft power measures of the, for instance, London Metropolitan Police, calling out some of them as being sort of terrorist or extremist in nature. And we've seen the same with environmental campaigning before. So in a sense, it's an extension of that pre-existing condition of the government to treat, in a sense, these groups that it finds challenging, or successive governments, treat these groups that it finds challenging in this mode of suspicion rather than mode of engagement. It is a bad faith engagement. It is not one of listening, it is not one of democratic participation. It is one that speaks to the authoritarian tendency of a rightist government.
Yeah, so what does this then mean then for just, like I said, basic freedoms and rights, right? I mean, I imagine this is also meant to discourage people from them coming out and protesting, right?
I'm not sure if it's designed to discourage, but I think that this is, because of the context we find ourselves in terms of the political situation with the UK government, as well as the COVID catastrophe, a war that the UK government lost, I think that this is a convenient time to, in a sense, revert to archetype in respect of a conservative government appearing tough and responding in this knee-jerk reaction, which is to appear tough in a law and order sense. Ostensibly, of course, these policies are because of security failings, that, you know, blokes were let out of prison, went on a stabbing rampage, and that was a, you know, criminal justice and counterterrorism nightmare. So in a sense, they have the cover of responding to that security threat. But they don't care about these groups, and they don't care about these causes, and they don't care about these already discriminated against communities, that is the British Muslim community, for instance. So these communities are always the ones with the shortest straw. And so we're seeing a further encroachment against them, in a sense, incidentally, because the government's having to revert and be seen to tackle something successfully and robustly. You know, it's just failed enormously in terms of the coronavirus situation. Poll ratings aren't looking good because actually the leadership style of the clown is now wearing off. They're having to do something manifest to convince people that they're in control. And this is an easy thing to do right now.
When we're talking about, you know, the BAME communities, if I may hone in on that, because within the context of what you'd mentioned with the COVID-19 pandemic, right, we know a lot of statistics have come out saying that even BAME staff members within NHS have not had proper PPE equipment or et cetera, like, you know, the very basics that you would expect everybody across the board to have access to. Will this distract enough from all of those shortcomings? I mean, because I imagine at some level that those are out there for public viewing to such an extent that it's really hard for the government to be able to convince everybody that, okay, we've done a good job towards the BAME communities?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm not sure, though, whether or not enough commentators and the political opposition in Britain will connect the dots and say, well, you know, because the thing is that security issues are so often tackled with a different ideological framework and with a different level of critical awareness. I'm not really sure that people will connect the dots in that respect. I think where there is a resistance against this development, though, there will be a resistance from the civil liberties point of view. The UK has a pretty robust civil liberties defense civil society, and I think Amnesty and Liberty and such groups will take on encroachments the best they can, as well as specific Muslim legal rights groups. They will take on the excesses of government in this respect. But unfortunately, I don't feel that broadly, the UK population has been able to internalize and fully comprehend the scale of disenfranchisement and, in a sense, second-class citizenship, BAME Britons have suffered under, because it doesn't really particularly reach that level of discourse. So I don't think that the dots will be connected, sadly.
All right, we're now joined by Umar Kankiya, who's a former mental health lawyer who is joining us from Essex. Omar, thank you for your time. What do you make, Omar, of this bill, which may very well include within the definition of terrorist extremists BLM protesters, environmentalists, those who are pro-migrant, etc.?
I think the issue that we have here is that it's looking to have a situation where you're encapsulating and catching all sorts of different ideologies and different movements that are protesting against a lot of the systemic injustices that a lot of people are facing. I mean, if we take the Black Lives Matter movement, for example, as a black person, we're not saying that we are looking for a way for everyone else to feel unequal. We're asking for equality. And I think the issue here is that this government doesn't believe in equality, and it's very obvious by the way that they've handled COVID-19. It's very obvious by the measures that they've taken over the last 10 years, which has systematically oppressed in some respects and also massively affected people from the black and minority ethnic communities. So this is just another way for the government to present to the rest of the public on the face of it that they are in control, but actually deflecting away from their own inadequacies and failures in how they've addressed these systemic inequalities in society.
As I'd put to Harry earlier, I wonder if a lot of this is meant to possibly discourage people from coming out, because the label, of course, of terrorist/extremist is one that I imagine is meant to dissuade others from coming out and protesting.
I mean, if you have that label, it's a label that will stick with you for life. So therefore, it's going to cause huge problems for people. If you're part of an organization, or you won't want to associate yourself with that organization or movement because you're having a fear of being labeled as a terrorist. And I think it is something that's of grave concern, because ultimately, a lot of these organizations that are protesting, whether it's on an environmental basis, whether it's on a racial basis, ultimately they are campaigning against inequalities that are affecting them in different ways. And I think for the government to try and extend this legislation to make it seem like they are acting in a way that is fundamentally looking to cause terror to the country is definitely something that is of grave concern. And I think, as one of your previous contributors said, a lot of organizations are likely to be taking this up. And I believe that this is something that will definitely be challenged in the courts.
Harry, I wonder, it doesn't make sense to make enemies out of the very communities who you claim you're trying to keep safe, right? So why not work with those communities, be it the Muslim community, the black community, or others, listen to their grievances and, actually come to a resolution with them on keeping the entire nation secure, because that's in the interest of everyone.
Yeah, I think the word oppression that Omar used hits the nail on the head. The engagement that successive governments have had with these communities has and this sounds extreme, but in a sense, I believe it's true to an extent. The engagement has almost been as if to control like a colonial population, that you don't really have a full spectrum of rights. You're not really quite like us. You don't enjoy our white privilege. Your grievances don't matter. You don't really count. And that vein actually captures not just the security policies, but also the policies vis-a-vis the coronavirus crisis and how vain Brits were treated, without a level of humanity and state support. So what I'm saying here is that actually there's a trend, which is that the grievances are not listened to and the humanity is not acknowledged, and we're facing that because the government represents it's a government of the 1%. It's a government of the 1%. So it has to project and portray the image that it's there for the majority of Brits, buying into the idea of what Britain 2020 is, or Brexit Britain 2020 is. Yeah. But it's not really. It only has to convince people enough to actually support the interests of the 1%. And what we're seeing with the coronavirus crisis is that actually if you can let 60,000 of your population die because of this pandemic, because of your economic and geopolitical ideology, then actually probably this is a harder image to keep up. And so we're seeing a tension between these issues.
All right. So then, as a final word to you, Umar, you've already mentioned, both of you already mentioned that no one will be going down without a fight when it comes to this regard, and that organizations will be appealing this and, of course, bringing this to the courts. But I wonder how much of a fight can the rest of Britain, those who are not white, put up in this regard? Do you think that there's enough of an alarm bell going on with those communities, I should say, about this issue?
Yeah, there definitely is a lot of alarm. And I think what's going to be key, and I've been saying this generally, is that we need white people who are allies to the movement that are going to help to speak up against what is happening, because that is what's going to be key. Because for us, being members of the ethnic minority community here in the UK, there's not enough of us to be able to kick up enough of a fuss for there to be change. I mean, we have got strong voices. We do have strong black organizations that do exist. But what we do need is the support of our white allies who are seeing these grave injustices and saying, actually, do you know what? This is not acceptable. We cannot have a situation where we're oppressing people on the basis of, wanting to fight inequalities in race, inequalities in the environment, inequalities in everyday life. Because fundamentally, for a person who's a person of color here in the UK, we've seen it with COVID, twice as likely if you're a black male to die from COVID, twice as likely if you're from the Bangladeshi community to die if you receive COVID. There's the grave levels of social inequality that's happening across the board. And I think people need to stand up and be counted and say enough is enough and challenge all of this.
Indeed. We'll have to leave it there at that. But of course, we thank both Harry and Umar for their time today and, of course, their insight. As always, when it comes to issues related to the UK, we have this terror bill now at the House of Commons. It's passed a second reading, probably very much will pass at some point soon. This is worrying, though, because it does have a fairly loose definition of who would be seen as a terrorist/extremist within the country, including BLM protesters, with very harsh sentences, mind you. And then for the rest of your life, really, then you're always under surveillance. You're always under this shadow of suspicion, even if you haven't actually committed a crime, even if you haven't even been charged with anything or nothing has been proven in a court of law within this bill. It's loose enough, seemingly, from the readings that I've made, that you would be then forever surveyed, really, and your family would also then obviously be under suspicion as well. What does this mean for minority communities and their relationship with the government there in the UK, or those who just protest, be it for environmental issues, or those supporting BLM protests who are not necessarily of the black community? A lot of concern here, certainly, and hopefully we will see this coming to the courts through appeals processes and otherwise. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.